Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Sunday night? Yehud in South Carolina, Bill in mid-Missouri, Bell in Florida, Nancy, North Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Gail in Kansas City, Sharon in New Jersey, Joe in the Inland Empire, Lucy in Minnesota, Sharon wishing everyone a happy Tu B'Shvat, the birthday of the trees. Chaim in Florida, Frank in San Pedro, Alan in New York City, Lynn in Canada, Michael. That's Mickey in New Jersey, Elise in Virginia, Ellen in Southern California, and Moishi in Brooklyn. Welcome, everybody. Our daf today is page 23 here in Tractate Menachot, the 30th volume of the Talmud. We're picking this up right at the top of page 23a and continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 3. It was stated that the Amoraim disagreed with regard to the halacha, the law, where one added oil to the handful that is removed from the meal offering of a sinner. That's a problem because the meal offering of a sinner is not accompanied with oil like most meal offerings. Rabbi Yochanan says it is unfit. Reish Lakish says the law of the meal offering itself is to wipe it ab initio and the remainder of the log of oil that remains in the vessels that were used previously for other meal offerings. And the priest then brings it up and burns it on the altar. And this is done so that the meal offering will not be completely dry. Right, so if in any way you're bringing the meal offering of a sinner in the same service vessels that are being used for other meal offerings that have oil in them, so there's going to be some residue of oil in those service vessels that contacts the dry meal offering and the meal offering of a sinner. So since that's the case, says Reish Lakish, if you had some more oil, why would that disqualify the meal offering of a sinner? Answer, because Rabbi Yochanan says so, and in disputes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, the law, the halacha, follows Rabbi Yochanan. Now, what is the reasoning of Rabbi Yochanan? Let's see. The Gemara asks, but isn't it written with regard to the meal offering of a sinner, he shall put no oil upon it, neither shall he put any frankincense upon it. That's Leviticus 5:11. How then can any oil be added? And the Gemara answers, the verse teaches that one should not designate oil for it, as one designates oil for other meal offerings, but the meal offering of a sinner is not rendered unfit by the addition of a small amount of oil. Now, maybe Rabbi Yochanan distinguishes between whatever residue is in that service vessel and actually adding oil, and says if you add oil, no good. And perhaps Reish Lakish doesn't make that distinction. Rabbi Yochanan raised an objection to Reish Lakish from a baraisa. In the case of a dry meal offering that was intermingled with a meal offering that was mixed with oil, the priest shall sacrifice it. Rabbi Yehuda says the priest shall not sacrifice it. Now what? Is the Baraisa not referring to a handful of the meal offering of a sinner that was intermingled with a handful of a voluntary meal offering, demonstrating that the oil invalidates the handful of a meal offering of a sinner? And Reish Lakish responded, no, the Bryce is referring to the meal offering that accompanies the libations brought with the offerings of bulls or rams, for which 2 log of oil is mixed with 1/10 of an ephah of flour that became intermingled with the meal offering that accompanies the libations brought with the offering of a sheep, for which 3 log of oil is mixed with 1/10 of an ephah of flour, as the former is considered dry relative to the latter. Now, our Mishnah said you can mix those. If those get mixed, you can remove the handfuls and burn them. Rabbi Yehuda said you can't, because that different ratio of oil means that in that mixture you're not going to be offering a proper handful, and that's why you wouldn't offer it. But that's the minority opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Now, Rabbi Yochanan objects to Reish Lakish's answer. He says, but another Baraisa teaches this explicitly as a separate law with regard to the meal offering that accompanies the offerings of bulls or rams that became intermingled with the meal offering that accompanies the offering of sheep, and a dry meal offering that was intermingled with a meal offering that was mixed with oil. The meal offering shall be sacrificed. So Rabbi Yehuda says it shall not be sacrificed. Therefore, the latter case must be referring to the other meal offerings. And Reish Lakish responded, the latter clause is explaining the first clause of the Baraisa, teaching that the reason one may not offer a meal offering that accompanies bulls and rams, that was intermingled with the meal offering that accompanies sheep, is because one may not offer a dry offering that was intermingled with one that is mixed with oil. Haven't they switched positions? Didn't Rabbi Yochanan say if oil gets added at all to the meal offering of a sinner, it's disqualified? But Reish Lakish says you can add that oil. And now they're arguing about when things are mixed, they can be offered, but Reish Lakish would say they can't. I'm a little confused, but I'm going to move on. Yeah, and in fact, the note here is the objection is not clear, as the opinion of Reish Lakish seems to accord with that of the first Tana in the Baraisa. And Rashi explains that the Tana holds that the meal offering shall be sacrificed only because items that is sent to the altar do not nullify one another. So the oil in the mixture is ascribed only to the meal offering into which it was initially mixed. But in the case discussed by Reish Lakish, where the oil was added directly to the meal offering of the sinner, the first Tana would hold that the meal offering should not be sacrificed. Okay. Now, Rava raises a dilemma. In the case of a handful, whose oil the priest squeezed onto the wood, and only afterward he placed a handful on the wood to be burned, what is the law? Right, so we've got our standard meal offering. A handful or oil is getting mixed into it. The handful is removed. Then, or I guess maybe the oil is. I'm not sure when the oil is added. I guess maybe to the handful. Although I thought the oil was added to the meal offering, and then the handful is taken. Okay. Then we add the salt and the frankincense, and then we burn it on the altar, standard meal offering. What they're saying here is, well, what if the oil didn't get added? Right? You took the handful. It needs to have oil mixed with it in order to be burned. But instead of adding the oil to the handful, they're just going to put the oil on the wood that's on the fire on the altar. And then they're going to put the handful on top of that. So the handful is going to be in contact with oil, which is in contact with wood, which is all going to burn. Perhaps the frankincense is added to that too. But it's like, it's almost like, I think I remember this from the 80s, right? Like sometimes they would like mix a drink in your mouth, wild parties. Instead of mixing it in the glass, they would mix it in your mouth, right? So it's like being mixed at the last moment, right? So it's being the oil and the flour being mixed literally at the fire. Is that considered in time so that the oil and the the flour of the meal offering were at the end mixed as they're burning? Or is it too late and you didn't do it properly because it was supposed to be a meal offering with its oil and the handful is mixed together before it's placed on the fire? So what is the law? Are substances that are contiguous to items that ascend upon the altar considered to be as part of the items that ascend upon the altar, in which case the oil that was absorbed into the wood and is contiguous to the handful of the meal offering is considered part of the handful, right? They went together on the fire, even though they're just next to each other, but is that close enough because they're contiguous? Or are they not considered to be part of the items that ascend upon the altar, and the oil is not viewed as part of the handful, and therefore the handful is missing its oil, and this offering has been rendered unfit? Ravina said to Rav Ashi, is this not the same disagreement as the dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish? As it was stated, with regard to one who offers up outside the temple courtyard. It's a different dispute of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Right? So in Tractate Zevachim, we talked about if you offer up outside the temple courtyard at a time when the temple exists and the altar is there. So if you offer up what should be offered on the altar and you offer it up on some private altar outside the courtyard, then you're guilty for offering up outside the courtyard. That is a prohibition, and if you offer up something outside the courtyard, you're liable to karas. Okay, so what about this? But that's only if what you offer up outside the courtyard was something that could have properly been offered up on the national altar inside the courtyard. So as it was stated, with regard to one who offers up outside the courtyard, a limb that contains less than an olive bulk is not significant, of meat, but the offering's bone completes the measure of the offering to an olive bulk. So the minimum measure is an olive bulk. You've got an olive bulk, but it's a combination of the meat of an offering and the bone. The bone is normally not offered up. Although if some bone is left on the flesh of the offering, that's okay. So, but can we use that little bit of bone to complete the minimum measure of an olive bulk? And if so, then one who offers up this mixture is the minimum measure of an olive bulk, so he would be guilty for offering up outside the temple courtyard and be subject to karas. Right, as it was stated, with regard to one who offers up outside the temple courtyard a limb that contains less than an olive bulk of meat, but the offering's bone completes the measure of the olive bulk. Rabbi Yochanan says he is liable, and Reish Lakish says he is exempt. So Rabbi Yochanan says that one is liable because he holds that substances that are contiguous to items that ascend upon the altar are considered to be part of the items that ascend upon the altar. So if the meat is touching the bone, that's going to combine and you can make the minimum measure out of it. Therefore, he would be liable if he offers this up outside the courtyard. And Reish Lakish says that one is exempt because he holds that substances that are contiguous to items that ascend upon the altar are not considered to be as part of those items. They're just touching them. Even though they're ascending upon the altar, and since there's less than an olive bulk of the actual meat, and you're offering it up outside the courtyard, you're not liable for offering outside the courtyard because it's not significant enough. It's less than the olive bulk. That bone is not going to be used to make up the full olive bulk. Rav Ashi responded that Rava's dilemma can be about putting the oil and the meal offering directly on the fire together, right? Like putting the oil on the fire and then adding the flour of the meal offering. And so we would consider that a proper handful. That was Rava's dilemma. So Rava's dilemma can be raised according to Rabbi Yochanan, and Rava's dilemma can be raised according to Reish Lakish. The circumstances in their dispute, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, about offering up the minimum measure constituted of half meat, half bone outside the courtyard, the logic of it is not going to be applicable to offering up some flour and some oil separately but touching each other on the wood of the fire on the altar in the courtyard, because these situations are too different for us to be able to extend the law from one to the other, as we shall see. The circumstances in their dispute are not the same as Rava's dilemma, so their opinions in that case may not be applicable to this one. Rav Ashi explains, the dilemma can be raised according to Rabbi Yochanan, even though he holds that the bone is considered to be part of the meat to complete the measure of an olive bulk. So perhaps Rabbi Yochanan says his opinion only there in the case of a bone, because the bone is the same type as the meat, i.e. it is from the same animal, and is therefore considered to be part of the sacrificial meat. But in the case of this oil, which is not the same type of substance as the handful of flour, wheat flour, it is not considered to be part of the handful, even if it is contiguous to it. Right? A bone and the meat, they come from the same animal. To say they're contiguous and can make up the same olive bulk, we can't apply that to oil and flour that were placed separately and then come into contact with each other at the stage of the fire on the altar. Or perhaps even according to Reish Lakish, he says his ruling only in the case of the bone, teaching that it does not add to the quantity of the meat. And the reason is the bone is able to be separated from the meat. And if it is separated, there is no mitzvah to return it to the fire. Therefore, he views it as distinct from the meat. But in this case of oil, which is not able to be separated from the handful of the meal offering, as it must be burned together with the handful, he will not hold that the oil is viewed as separate from the handful. Or perhaps there is no difference between the case of the bone and the case of the oil, and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish would have the same opinions respectively in both cases. We don't know, and therefore the Gemara says this dilemma shall stand unresolved. Take coup. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah 3 here in chapter 3. We move on to Mishnah number 4. In the case of two meal offerings, from which a handful was not removed, right? The handful has not yet been removed. We have two handfuls, let's say brought by two different people. The handful has not yet been removed. And those meal offerings, before the handfuls were removed, they became intermingled. If the priest can remove a handful from this meal offering by itself and from that meal offering by itself, they are fit offerings. But if not, they are unfit, as the handful of each meal offering must be taken from its original source. So imagine you dumped a bunch of red M&Ms on a pile of blue M&Ms, right? You didn't mix them all up, so there's blue and red mixed everywhere. You can pretty clearly see, here are the red M&Ms, here are the blue M&Ms. If I needed to take a handful out of this pile, I could take just red M&Ms and I could take just blue M&Ms. Likewise, if the two handfuls were intermingled such that you could tell which is which, then you could take a handful from this one and a handful from that one. We could do it, no problem. But if they become so intermingled that you can't take separate handfuls and know that they came from the original offerings, then they are unfit, as the handful of each offering must be taken from its original source. In the case of a handful that was intermingled with a meal offering from which a handful was not removed, so the handful of one was removed, that handful became intermingled with a meal offering whose handful has not yet been removed. The priest should not burn this mixture on the altar. But if he did burn it, this meal offering from which the handful was taken satisfies the obligation of its owner, since its handful was removed properly and that ended up getting burned. And that other meal offering from which the handful was not removed, it does not satisfy the obligation of its owner. If after it was removed, its handful was intermingled with the remainder of another meal offering, the priest should not burn the mixture on the altar, but if he burned it, it does satisfy the obligation of the owner. That's Mishnah 4. Now, the Gemara. Rav Chisda says, the meat of an unslaughtered animal carcass, that's a neveila. That neveila is a kosher animal that was not slaughtered in a kosher manner. A Jew cannot eat that. That's called an unslaughtered animal carcass. That's called a neveila. Right? So Rav Chisda says a neveila is nullified in a larger quantity of meat of a slaughtered animal. So this sounds like we're not talking necessarily about offerings. if you just had a kosher animal, that was not slaughtered by a shochet, right, by the kosher slaughterer, and then you had another pot, and so there's some meat here, a steak from a neveila, and then you have a pile of steaks from the kosher butcher, right, that were slaughtered properly. And this one steak of neveila got intermingled with these other steaks, the majority of which are kosher, right, are from the kosher butcher. Sounds like the steak of neveila gets nullified in a larger quantity of kosher steaks. Although meat from a neveila generally imparts tumah, if one touches the mixture of the two meats, he does not become tameh, as the carcass meat is considered a different type of substance from the slaughtered animal and is therefore nullified. So they're not saying you can eat steaks from this pile. What they're saying is if you came into contact with a carcass, an unslaughtered carcass, it imparts tumah. A kosher animal that was slaughtered in a kosher manner, if you touch it, it doesn't impart tumah. You don't become tameh from it. So what it means that the meat of neveila becomes nullified in the larger quantity of kosher meat is simply that this mixture will not impart tumah if you touch it. Doesn't mean that they're not saying you can eat it. Now, why is that? This is not considered a mixture that comprises a substance in contact with the same type of substance because meat from a slaughtered animal cannot attain the status of a neveila, and it is therefore viewed as a different type of substance. Slaughtered meat, right, from a kosher meat, from a kosher animal, slaughtered properly, it can never become tameh. Whereas, what they're going to say now is that the meat from a neveila, it imparts tumah, but once it rots to the point that it is inedible, it no longer imparts tumah. So with respect to imparting tumah, the meat from a neveila can become like the meat from a kosher animal, but the meat from a kosher animal can never become like the meat of a neveila. So by contrast, if meat of a slaughtered animal became intermingled with a larger quantity of meat of neveila, the meat of the slaughtered animal is not nullified in the larger quantity of meat of the neveila, as it is possible for the neveila to attain the status of a slaughtered animal with regard to the laws of tumah, as it can lose its ability to transmit tumah. And this is because when a neveila rots to the extent that it is no longer edible, it loses its tameh status. The law that the carcass meat, the neveila meat, has the ability to attain the ritually pure status of slaughtered meat renders the two meats as the same type of substance, and the mixture retains its status of intermingled neveila meat and slaughtered meat. And Rabbi Hanina says the opposite. Any small quantity of an item that can possibly become like the item that is present in larger quantities is not nullified when the two are intermingled. But any small quantity of an item that cannot possibly become like the item that is present in larger quantities is nullified in the larger quantity. Accordingly, a small quantity of slaughtered meat is nullified in a larger quantity of neveila meat, since the meat of the slaughtered animal cannot become like the neveila meat. But a small quantity of neveila meat is not nullified in a larger quantity of slaughtered meat, since it can lose its impure status and become akin to the meat of the slaughtered animal. Again, the counterintuitive thing here is if things are not very similar to each other, then the smaller quantity can become nullified in the larger quantity because it's obvious what the mixture is. But if the two things look exactly alike, they're of the same kind, then if the little one is tameh and the big one, the little quantity is tameh, the large quantity is tahor, the small quantity of tameh meat will not be nullified in the larger quantity because they're of the same type, and the sages are more strict in that situation since you can more easily come to transgress when the mixed things are not identifiable in the mixture. Now the Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion do Rabbi Hanina and Rav Chisda state their opinions? If their opinions are in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, this is difficult. Didn't the rabbis say that it is the case of a mixture of items that is sent to the altar? It is in the case of a mixture of items that is sent to the altar. We're talking about offerings going up to the altar. That the different components of the mixture do not nullify one another, but otherwise a substance in contact with the same type of substance would be nullified. Are we going to apply that principle of they're not nullified if they're the same type only when we're talking about meat of offerings going up on the altar? Therefore, in any case where meat of a slaughtered animal becomes intermingled with meat of neveila, the smaller quantity would be nullified in the larger quantity. And that doesn't seem to be what they said. So it doesn't work according to the rabbis. So if their opinions are in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that the blood of an offering is not nullified in the blood of a non-sacred animal because the two are the same type of substance, this is also difficult. But Rabbi Yehuda follows the appearance of the item in determining whether the two items are of the same type of substance. And therefore, this meat of slaughtered animal and that meat of neveila are viewed as a substance in contact with the same type of substance, since visually you can't tell the difference. Now we're on 23b. So rather, it must be explained that the opinions of Rav Chisda and Rabbi Hanina are in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Chia. As Rabbi Chia teaches, the meat of neveila and the meat of slaughtered animal are nullified one in the other. Rav Chisda understands this statement to mean that the meat of neveila is nullified in a larger quantity of slaughtered animal meat, whereas Rabbi Hanina understands this statement to be referring to meat of slaughtered animal that is nullified in a larger quantity of neveila meat. So the Gemara asks, but then in accordance with whose opinion did Rabbi Chia himself state his opinion? If his opinion is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, it doesn't work, because didn't the rabbis say that it is in the case of a mixture of items that is sent to the altar that the different components of the mixture do not nullify one another, but in general, a substance in contact with the same type of substance would be nullified? And if his statement is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, it also doesn't work, because according to the statement of Rabbi Yehuda, any substance in contact with the same type of substance is not nullified. And so the Gemara answers, actually, the statement of Rabbi Chia is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Chia holds that when Rabbi Yehuda says that a substance in contact with the same type of substance is not nullified, this statement applies only where it is possible for one to become like the other. Very interesting, right? Is there a possibility for one substance to become like the other? As we've seen here, meat from a slaughtered animal can never become like neveila meat, but neveila meat can become like slaughtered meat in the sense that it will not impart tumah anymore once it rots, like the meat from a slaughtered animal never could impart tumah. And Rav Chisda and Rabbi Hanina disagree with regard to this. As Rav Chisda holds that we follow the potentially nullifying substance, i.e. the larger quantity, and if it can attain the status of the smaller quantity, the two are considered identical substances, and the smaller quantity is not nullified in the larger quantity. Therefore, if meat of a slaughtered animal became mingled with a larger quantity of neveila meat, the meat of the slaughtered animal is not nullified, as it is possible for a neveila to attain the status of a slaughtered animal with regard to tumah, as when the carcass rots, it loses its impure status. And Rabbi Hanina holds that we follow the potentially nullified substance, i.e. the smaller quantity, and only if it can attain the status of the larger quantity, for example, in the case of the meat of a carcass, of a neveila, that was intermingled with a larger quantity of meat of slaughtered animal, the two are considered identical substances, and the smaller quantity is not nullified in the larger quantity. So now the Gemara offers support for the opinion of Rabbi Hanina. We learned in the Mishna, in the case of two meal offerings from which a handful was not removed and which were intermingled with each other. Now we're back to why we're talking about this, our Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 3. Right? We learned in the Mishnah, in the case of two meal offerings from which a handful was not removed and which were intermingled with each other, If the priest can remove a handful from this and a handful from that, because they're still identifiable in the mixture, then they are fit meal offerings. But if they become so intermingled that he can't remove the handful and know that it came from the original meal offering, then they are unfit. The handfuls cannot be removed, and the owners are going to have to bring new meal offerings. And here, once he removes a handful from one, the rest of it becomes the remainder, which is designated for the priest. And this remainder does not nullify the other meal offering from which a handful has not yet been removed. So in accordance with whose opinion is the Mishnah? If it is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, this is difficult. Didn't the rabbis say that in the case of a mixture of items that is sent to the altar, that the different components of the mixture do not nullify one another? But in general, a substance in contact with the same type of substance is nullified. Therefore, since we are talking about offerings that ascend the altar and these meal offerings, therefore the remainder of the first meal offering should nullify the second meal offering, as both consist of the same substances, flour and oil. So rather, it is obvious that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that the meal offering is not nullified in the remainder, as any substance in contact with the same type of substance is not nullified. Now, granted, according to Rabbi Hanina, who is the one who says that we follow the potentially nullified substance, in the Mishnah's case, the potentially nullified substance can become like the potentially nullifying substance, as when the priest removes a handful from the other meal offering, the intermingled offering will become a remainder that is designated for the priests, just like that of the first meal offering. Therefore, the intermingled second meal offering is not nullified in the remainder of the first meal offering. But according to Rav Chisda, who is the one who says that we... Yes, sir. But according to Rav Chisda, who is the one who says that we follow the potentially nullifying substance? But according to Rav Chisda, who is the one who says that we follow the potentially nullifying substance, the larger quantity, can the remainder of the first meal offering become a meal offering from which a handful has not yet been removed? Therefore, shall we say that according to Rav Chisda, the Mishnah here is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Chia with regard to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion? And the Gemara answers, there, the law of the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Zera. As Rabbi Zera says, that the verse teaches that nullification does not take place when remainders are intermingled with handfuls. And he explains the term burning is stated with regard to the handful that is removed from the meal offering, as it is a mitzvah to burn the handful. And the term burning is stated with regard to the remainder of the meal offering, as it is taught that it is prohibited to burn the remainder. So this verbal analogy teaches that just as in the case of the burning that is stated with regard to the handful, if two handfuls are mixed together, one handful does not nullify the other, and all agree that the two are burned on the altar. So too in the case of the burning that is stated with regard to the remainder of the meal offering, if the remainder of one meal offering is intermingled with the remainder of another meal offering, the remainder of the meal offering does not nullify the handful or the remainder of the second meal offering. Now, the Gemara suggests, come in here a proof from the Mishnah here. In the case of the handful that was intermingled with a meal offering from which a handful was not removed, the priest should not burn the mixture on the altar. And if he did burn it, this meal offering from which the handful was taken, after the fact, satisfies the obligation of the owner, and the meal offering from which the handful was not taken did not satisfy the obligation of its owner. This is a case of a mixture of identical substances, and the meal offering from which a handful has not yet been removed does not nullify the handful, since after the fact, if the mixture is burned on the altar, the meal offering from which the handful was taken satisfies the obligation of the owner. Right? So they're saying that you have a meal offering, handful was taken out properly. Then that handful got mixed up, intermingled with another meal offering. Its handful has not yet been removed. And then they burn that whole thing on the altar. Now they shouldn't have done that, but they did it. So in that case, it satisfies the obligation of the first owner whose meal offering had its handful removed. How could it satisfy his obligation? It must mean that even though that its handful got intermingled with other flour and oil, it wasn't nullified. And so when it was burned on the altar, it completed the process for the first owner. Now, the second owner, if you then took a handful from that mixture and burned that, it's not going to satisfy his obligation. So that sounds like I guess it was too late to take a handful knowing that it came from that meal offering, because the handful that got mixed into it is going to make it impossible to take a handful separately, right? We know that if you can take a handful knowing that that handful is only from the original offering, then it can work, and maybe it got so intermingled that you can't take that handful from the second offering, only because a handful, not a whole meal offering, but a handful got intermingled with it and got really intermingled with it. So the Gemara suggests, come in here a proof from the Mishnah here. In the case of the handful that was intermingled with a meal offering from which a handful was not removed, the priest should not burn the mixture on the altar, but if he did burn it, this meal offering from which the handful was taken does satisfy the obligation of the owner, and the meal offering from which the handful was not taken did not satisfy the obligation of its owner. This is a case of a mixture of identical substances, and the meal offering from which a handful has not yet been removed does not nullify the handful, since after the fact that the mixture is burned on the altar, the meal offering from which the handful was taken satisfies the obligation of the owner. And the Gemara explains its proof. In accordance with whose opinion is the Mishnah? If it is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, that is difficult. Didn't the rabbis say that it is a case of a mixture of items that ascend to the altar? It's only in that situation that the different components of the mixture do not nullify one another. But in general, a substance that is in contact with a same type of substance would be nullified. So rather, it is obvious that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that any substance in contact with the same type of substance is not nullified. Now, granted, according to Rav Chisda, who is the one who says that we follow the potentially nullifying substance, in the Mishnah's case, the potentially nullifying substance can become like the potentially nullified substance, since every bit of the meal offering is fit to have the handful taken from it. And therefore, the mixture is considered to be one that consists of a substance in contact with the same type of substance, and a substance in contact with the same type of substance is not nullified. Right? Two different kinds of comparison. Is it about quantity in the nullifying and the nullified substance? Or is it about substances that are headed for the altar, touching something that is the same kind of substance? Now, granted, okay. But according to Rabbi Hanina, who is the one who these sentences are really hard to read. But according to Rabbi Hanina, who is the one who says that we follow the potentially nullified substance, can the handful become a meal offering from which a handful has not yet been removed, so that it would not be nullified by the other meal offering whose handful was not removed? Therefore, shall we say that according to Rabbi Hanina, the Mishnah here is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Chia with regard to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion? The Gemara answers, this Mishnah as well is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Zera, who explains that a Torah edict establishes that the remainder does not nullify the handful, and similarly, the meal offering from which a handful has not yet been removed does not nullify the handful. So the Gemara suggests, come in here a proof from the Mishnah here. If after it was removed, its handful was intermingled with the remainder of another meal offering, the priest should not burn the mixture on the altar, but if he did burn it, it satisfied the obligation of the owner. So the Gemara explains how this is a proof. But here, the potentially nullifying substance cannot become like the potentially nullified substance, since the remainder of the meal offering cannot become like the handful. The remainder is eaten, the handful is burned. And the potentially nullified substance cannot become like the potentially nullifying substance, since the handful cannot become like the remainder. And the Mishnah teaches that the remainder of the offering does not nullify the handful. Right? They can't become like each other, and so they don't nullify one another. Okay. So in accordance with whose opinion is the Mishnah? If it is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, that is difficult. Didn't the rabbis say that it is in the case of a mixture of items that is sent to the altar that different components of the mixture do not nullify one another. Otherwise, they would. Rather, it is obvious that the Mishna is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that any substance in contact with the same type of substance is not nullified. But in contrast to Rabbi Chia's statement, Rabbi Yehuda apparently holds that nullification takes place even if the nullifying substance cannot become like the nullified substance, or if the nullifying substance cannot become like the nullifying, if the nullified substance cannot become like the nullifying substance. I know you're going to hate to hear this, but I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Rabbi Zera said, this Mishnah is an independent law, based on a Torah edict that nullification does not take place when remainders are intermingled with handfuls. The term burning is stated with regard to the handful, and the term burning is stated with regard to the remainder. And the verbal analogy teaches that just as in the case of the burning that is stated with regard to the handful, one handful does not nullify the other, and all agree that the two are burned on the altar, and so too in the case of the burning that is stated with regard to the remainder of the meal offering. If the remainder of one offering is intermingled with another meal offering, the remainder of the meal offering does not nullify the handful or the remainder of the second meal offering. So the Gemara now suggests another proof from a Baraisa, coming here, in the case of matzah, that one seasoned with black cumin, with sesame, or with any type of spice, it is fit to be eaten during the festival of Passover, as it is still considered matzah, but we call it seasoned matzah. And the Gemara comments, it enters your mind to explain that this is a case where there were more spices than matzah itself. So granted, according to Rabbi Hanina, who is the one who says that we follow the potentially nullified substance? In the case here, the potentially nullified substance can become like the potentially nullifying substance, as when the matzah becomes moldy, it becomes like the spices, and it is no longer fit to be used to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah. Matzah has to be unleavened bread, pure, adding these spices, you might think it renders it unfit, but they're talking only about a case where there's so much spice added that once it becomes moldy, it's going to be just like the spices, and, neither moldy matzah nor spice without attachment to matzah could satisfy the obligation to eat matzah. Therefore, the smaller quantity of matzah is not nullified by the larger quantity of spices. But according to Rav Chizda, who is the one who says that we follow the potentially nullifying substance, can the spices become like the matzah? How could the spices ever become like the matzah? The matzah can be used to fulfill our obligation on Pesach. The spices can't. So the Gemara answers, what are we dealing with here? We are dealing with a case where there are not more spices than matzah, but rather the majority is matzah, and therefore the matzah is not nullified. So the Gemara notes, according to this explanation, the language of the Baraisa is also precise, as it teaches it is considered matzah, but it is called seasoned matzah. And learn from here that the Baraisa is referring to an entity whose majority is matzah, and therefore it is referred to as seasoned matzah. That's where we're going to end. And God willing, tomorrow it'll become clearer what the different principles are that we're trying to balance, right? There's simple majority, right? So can something that is in the minority become nullified in a majority? And that seems to be depending on, are the substances so similar to each other that when we normally say if the substances are just basically the same kind of substance, then the smaller quantity will not be nullified in the larger quantity. But if they're identifiable even in the once mixed, then the smaller quantity could become nullified in the larger quantity. But with the caveat that we may have different rules if we're talking about items that are ascending to the altar. We might have different rules if we're talking about laws of tumah versus laws of are we fulfilling an obligation to bring an offering by burning the handful, etc. Okay, one comment from Lucy. What happens when the priest is not aware of the fact that two offerings were intermingled when the two meal offerings look identical, and he may not know from which offering he took the handful. Right, so remember, we are talking about what actually is the law, even if it's not, as a practical matter, enforceable. Very often we have to make that distinction. So, they're asking, okay, well, if he can identify them, could he still pull out the handfuls? If after the fact he realized that two meal offerings became intermingled, and he pulled out one handful not knowing that there were two offerings there, right? Sounds like if probably both are unfit. It sounds like to me. If he realizes after they're intermingled, but before he pulls out the handful, then the question is, can he tell which is which, even in that mixture? If he can't, then they're rendered unfit. He can't take a handful knowing which offering it came from, and so the owners have to bring new meal offerings. But I think that if he intermingled the two meal offerings and didn't know that there were two in there, and then he just took a handful out and burned that, so then we ask after the fact, did either of those people satisfy their obligation? Only one handful was taken out of this mixture. We haven't really asked that question yet, but it would seem to me like even after the fact, this could not have satisfied their obligation because only one handful was taken out and there were two meal offerings in there. So if they were really intermingled, he could have only possibly taken half a handful worth from each offering. So I would say this whole thing is unfit and the owners would have to bring new meal offerings. That's my instinct. I'm certainly not a poskening Rav, so I don't know. But that's my instinct. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday at the regular Monday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a good night.